Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, as usual, James W. Jesso, and I am out here, if you're watching this on YouTube, in the beautiful weather, maybe soon to be thunderstorms of Ontario, where I live in the park. And so hopefully the wind, if it picks up, won't be too disruptive to the audio from here. I'm outside today instead of in the studio, specifically to celebrate as an extension of excitement around this being the 50th episode, a real milestone in anyone's podcasting career, and also because I've stored up an episode for you, an interview with one of my favorite thinkers right now, and that person's name is Bernardo Kastrup. Bernardo's work has been really influential for me over the last few years as I have been coming to grapple with my own sort of transcendental experiences and finding linguistic and conceptual frameworks, platforms to discuss these trans-rational experiences that I've had and really just to explore the nature of consciousness, which is something that I'm very interested in. So I'm really excited to share this episode with you, not only because it's episode 50 and not only because I'm a huge fan of Bernardo's work, but also because I feel like what he is offering is really of value right now in the world, especially to people who are trying to come to terms with psychedelic experiences that radically transcend the normal conceptions of reality and that obviously fly in the face of the sort of base model ontology for reality that we have here in the Western world, which is basically physicalism. This idea that everything that exists is basically just physical components, machinery interacting with itself, and we are some strange epiphenomenon accident that emerged out of it. So I'm happy to be bringing you guys this what I think is a really great episode, and I really hope that you enjoy it as well. Big shout out to the 3 or so people that specifically requested to get Bernardo on the show. I had already been interested in wanting to have him on the show and obviously following his work, but your encouragement put the impetus in that to make it happen right away, and I'm glad that I was able to make it happen in time to save it up for here on episode 50. So on behalf of myself and everyone else who's going to enjoy it, to those people who suggested I check out Bernardo, thank you. Before we move into this interview with Bernardo, there's a few announcements. The first is that I got another 5-star review on iTunes from Shooter Guy 7 out of Canada. He says, "Truly one of my favorite podcasts. Listening to Adventures Through the Mind has helped me reconnect with a long-lost part of my inquisitive self." Thank you, Shooter Guy 7. I'm glad you're enjoying the show, and I appreciate that you made the extra effort to let other people know that too via the medium of iTunes reviews. The next announcement is that you might have noticed that the podcast intro music has shifted. I am happy to bring you this new music as a celebration of a milestone here in the podcast, in the ATTMind, Adventures Through the Mind podcasting journey. It was designed by the same person who made the original music, which is Mighty Oak. He also goes by the name Daitia. Daitia is his psytrance music project. He also goes by the legal name Andrew Daniels. He's a very good friend of mine, and I'm always excited to help utilize this podcast as a platform to not only ensure that the ideas of the interviewees get spread out and shared amongst, but that it can also work as a platform to help promote and distribute the hard work and creative output of others as well, and also that the funding for this podcast, which comes from you, the listeners, can be filtered out into other independent creators, creating a larger ecology of economic, not only sustainability but fucking thrival in an otherwise sort of difficult economic situation here on the planet for people who want to make stuff and inspire people without trying to sell them shit. Another announcement, the second last, is that I am about to, or well, I guess given this current day when this podcast is being released, I will already be out on my summer 2017 speaking tour, giving a talk called Healing the Past, Healing the Future, about inherited family trauma and some of my my platform, my conceptual model around it, and how I have been learning to deal with it in my own life. If you want to see where I'm going to be speaking, you can head to jameswjesso.com/events, and you can come check me out. You could also just utilize that as an opportunity to find out when I will be in your city and send me a personal message and invite me out for a cup of tea. The final announcement is that this podcast is brought to you by you. That's right. The listeners of Adventures Through the Mind are also the patrons of Adventures Through the Mind. We together are building this. So thank you very much to all of the patrons on Patreon that are helping this show be funded, helping this show grow, and helping it become a sustainable revenue stream for me to continue my mission of, I guess, bettering the world somehow through my creative work. There's a squirrel behind me. It's very distracting. They're all fighting over seems to be a large loaf of bread. Great. So yeah, this podcast is brought to you by you via Patreon. So thank you to all my patrons, especially Wes, Greg, Melanie, and Thomas, who are patrons at the highest reward tier. These squirrels are dropping stuff all over the computer here. Right. So I guess these are the complexities of trying to shoot outside. A special thank you to Wes, Greg, Melanie, and Thomas for your significant contributions over the last few months, and also to all of my patrons for supporting the show, and to everyone who is leaving one-time PayPal, Bitcoin, or Ethereum donations. If this is your first time tuning into the show and you don't know, you can head over to jameswjesso.com/support to take a look at the support options, including Patreon, which I just mentioned. Or if you're already an Patreon person, you can just search me up, James W. Jesso, and find me there. Finally, we are here, the interview with Bernardo Kastrup on Adventures Through the Mind, episode 50. Enjoy. Welcome, Bernardo Kastrup, to the show.
Great to be here, James. Great to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too. So jumping right in, I'm going to describe to you the first experience I had with your work. I was listening to a podcast through the Psychedelics Salon, a lecture that you produced called The Metaphysics of Psychedelics, which the title really had me right from the get-go. Like, all right, what's this guy got to say? And there was a point in which I was listening to it. I was driving from the west coast of Canada to Calgary, Alberta, which is about a 2-day drive through the Rockies. And my friend is sleeping in the back. My other friend is sitting up front with me, and we're attentively listening, driving through this beautiful landscape. And you progress very well to a point wherein you describe everything that is perceived as the world around us as the objective perception of various thought processes happening inside the mind of God from the perspective of a dissociated, altered identity, or a localization of specific thought processes within that larger mind, which I identify as me. And I actually, looking around at the trees and the mountains and all these things, it struck me so profoundly that I started to slip into a bit of an altered state, listening to you having said that, or at least guiding me into that mode of perception. But I was driving a car, and my attachment to maintaining this particular localization was fairly strong. So I didn't really get to go fully into that, but it was really profound.
Wow. So, interesting to know I had this effect. I didn't expect it.
Yeah, I imagine I'm not the only one. Now that's pretty deep right off the bat for the listener who might not know anything about your work. So why don't you pull apart a little bit what I just described and lay the foundation for your philosophy, or I guess your perspective on consciousness, reality, and the nature of the universe.
The nature of this whole game, right? The nature of what is. I come, originally from even a scientific background, very hard-nosed, skeptical, looking for a parsimonious explanation. So that's my background and sort of colors how I think about things. So the way I started from this, in this journey, I worked on artificial intelligence for several years. I had these fantasies of, creating a conscious artificial being through the programming and designing and building of computers. And I was young. I have this in my favor. I was very young and naive when I was doing those things. And you always come back, when you are in that journey, you always come back to the question, whatever I do, however I wire this thing up, however I program this thing, what reason do I have to believe that it's conscious in any way, any more conscious than, I don't know, an abacus or a car engine? Why do I think that complexity would create the extraordinary property of having qualities of experience? I mean, I had no reason to think that. And whatever you do, whatever you design into that thing in terms of complexity, philosophically, you have no reason to believe that you would create consciousness. So I was stuck in that realization, which is an artificial problem that we create for ourselves the moment we make this unexamined assumption that the world around us is separate and independent from consciousness, and that consciousness somehow arises out of particular configurations of this world. Like if you put atoms together in just the right way, somehow, poof, magically consciousness pops in. It's this assumption that creates this insoluble problem of trying to deduce qualities of experience from physical parameters. That's an unbridgeable ontological gap. There is nothing about physical parameters that would allow you to deduce how it feels to see the color red, how it feels to have a heartbreak, how it feels to be hungry. Physical parameters only give you function and structure. They don't give you any qualities. They don't tell you how it feels, anything.
And this is what's called the hard problem of consciousness, right?
That's the hard problem of consciousness, yes. Our inability to deduce the qualities of experience from physical parameters, whatever the parameters are, however they are arranged. And then it dawned on me that nature gives us the answers, right? We just have to look with an open mind. And then nature is right there showing us how things work. If you're a surgeon, a neurosurgeon, and you're operating on the brain of a living person, you know that what you observe in that brain, those patterns of electrical activity, the anatomy of the neurons, how they connect together, you know that that very concrete object in front of you, that brain, made of atoms and force fields of the same kind as the rest of the entire universe, you know that behind that very solid, concrete object that you can cut and cauterize, there lies the conscious life of a living being, with heartbreaks, with great successes and disappointments, with great love stories, with immeasurable suffering, with unfathomable happiness, journeys and experiences beyond description. All of those qualities lie somehow behind that very concrete object made of atoms and force fields underneath your scalpel. And that's an empirical fact. Nature is telling us that matter corresponds to subjective inner life in the form of a brain. And since there is nothing about a brain, as far as we know today, in terms of which we could say the brain is special for generating experience, then we have to assume that the same holds for all matter in the entire universe. That what we call physical activity, be it neuroactivity or the activity of galaxies and star clusters, again, galaxy clusters, that is the outside image of fundamentally mental processes. In other words, that physicality is what the mentation looks like from a second-person perspective. My first-person perspective is what I'm perceiving and feeling right now while I'm talking to you. And the second-person perspective of my inner life is what you and the audience is observing right now. My body, my eyes, my skin, my movements. So nature is telling us that that's what physicality is. It's the extrinsic appearance, the outside view of mental processes. It's what mental processes look like from across a dissociative boundary. And my entire philosophy is built on this idea.
Mm-hmm. And so are you saying that that all things that we perceive as outside are, well, you're saying that they're expressions of mental processes, but are they conscious in the sense that do they have conscious? Are you talking about panpsychism here? And what do you see as the difference between, like, is a mountain or a rock, or does it have the same consciousness as a tree or a person or an animal? Like, where do you draw the lines here?
So let's go back to what nature is telling us. Consider a single individual neuron in your brain right now. It is there, it is active, it's firing or not firing, whatever. There are electrical fluctuations, it's releasing neurotransmitters. Is there anything it feels like to be that single neuron in and of itself, as far as you are concerned? There isn't, right? There is only something it is like to be your entire brain, your entire nervous system, that is James Jesso. There is nothing it's like to be that single neuron in and by itself. Yet that single neuron and its activity is an intrinsic, integral part of your nervous system. It's part of what it looks like to be or to feel like James Jesso from a second-person perspective. It's a set of pixels in a broader image. Now, when we talk about the rest of the universe, I would go along these same lines. Is there anything it is like to be my mobile phone in and of itself? I have no reason to believe that. I don't think there is nothing it is like to be my cell phone. But my cell phone is part of the inanimate universe as a whole, just like the single neuron in my brain is part of my nervous system as a whole. I think there is something it is like to be the inanimate universe as a whole. I think the inanimate universe is the extrinsic appearance, a kind of nervous system, if you will, a universal nervous system that mirrors is a representation of universal inner life. That doesn't mean that my mobile phone is conscious. What it means is that my mobile phone is in consciousness. There is an important distinction between saying that something is conscious, in other words, that it has inner life in and of itself, and saying that something is in consciousness, in other words, that it exists only insofar as it corresponds to phenomenality or qualities of experience. So, my computer, my cell phone, my home thermostat, a knife in my kitchen, a statue in my garden, I believe they all exist in consciousness. Are they conscious in and of themselves? No, for the same reason that a single neuron in your brain is not conscious. Do you understand what I mean?
Kind of like it's not E equals MC squared, but big C equals MC squared kind of thing?
All I'm saying is that all physicality corresponds to mental activity, to conscious activity, at some level. But I'm not saying that every subset of the universe corresponds to separate individual conscious inner life at its own level. A neuron in your brain corresponds to conscious inner life at the level of James Jesso. But that single neuron in your brain does not correspond to inner life at its own level. In other words, there is no separate inner life of that neuron alone. There is only the inner life of James Jesso, whose extrinsic appearance, your nervous system, consists of several parts. The neuron, the individual neuron, being one part, like a pixel in a portrait. A portrait has meaning as a whole. Individual pixels in it are just components of that overall meaning. Your inner life has meaning as a whole. It's what it's like to be James Jesso. the individual neuron is just part of the extrinsic appearance of that inner life. But it doesn't have an inner life in and of its own. To say that something has an inner life in and of its own means that we are saying that there is dissociation in universal consciousness, and that a certain subset of the universe corresponds to dissociated inner life. I think you and I correspond to dissociated inner life in universal consciousness, because I don't know what's going on in the universe across time and space. I don't know what your thoughts and your feelings are right now. I am dissociated from you. I am dissociated from the conscious stream behind the inanimate universe. I don't know what the inanimate universe is thinking. So I am dissociated. You are dissociated. Is my mobile phone dissociated? I don't think so, because I think metabolism, biology, is the extrinsic appearance of dissociation. It's what dissociation looks like. My mobile phone does not metabolize. It's not alive. It doesn't have, there's no biology in it. There is no DNA. There's no transcription. There's no protein folding, all of those good things that characterize life. So I see no reason, no more reason to believe that my mobile phone is conscious than to believe that my table is conscious or that a rock in a mountain is conscious. But I do believe that all of these things are in consciousness and exist only insofar as they are excitations of consciousness.
Okay, so tapping into some of the further understanding that I have of your work beyond what we've talked about so far, what you're ultimately saying is that as far as we know, the only thing, the whole universe, all of reality is like a singular mind. And within that singular mind are various thought processes. And that we as metabolic creatures that have a sense of to be or an inner life are alters dissociative identities, like dissociative identity disorder that we see in people existing within that larger consciousness, interacting with various aspects of the of consciousness, manifesting in different ways, sometimes manifesting as alters, which is representative as metabolism, and sometimes representing not alters, but other thought processes that are expressions of sort of the equivalent to the universal mind's nervous system, in the same way that the neurons and the various sort of electrical conductivity in my body would equate not to an alter or an individual identity, but as components that make up a larger identity.
Exactly. You put it perfectly. And it may sound all very complicated first time one hears it, but it's extraordinarily simple. The complication comes from the fact that we have to counter all the cultural assumptions that have built up over the centuries and which people sort of take for granted without examining them. That's why it sounds complicated, because you have to to counter all that, to take all that out of the way so one can see the simplicity underlying all this. That all is mind is sort of self-evident before you get contaminated with all these assumptions, hidden assumptions about the nature of reality that we get from culture and education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is something that I've talked about in discussions and debates with others, that in leaning into your work and the language that you've offered is this idea that the only thing that we can really fully, completely verify is that which experiences, that experience is happening, and then everything else sort of enfolds around that, and that there's some sort of key subjectivity to all of existence. But then we also see that there's physical components and stuff that we can observe and track and find universal laws and stuff. So
existence. Go ahead.
I was actually about to lean into the next question, so please go ahead with what you're saying.
Existence is subjectivity. Anything beyond subjectivity is a theoretical inference. It's an explanatory model. It's a way for us to try to make sense of certain patterns and regularities that we see around us. We all seem to share the same world. So if the world is mental, then it's kind of like a dream. So how come you and I are having sort of self-consistent dreams, or even the same dream if we were next to each other? It doesn't seem to compute. Or if the world is a mental, it's kind of like an imagination stream. And if that is so, why can't I change the laws of nature just by wishing them to be different? Or why are there these correlations between patterns of brain activity and a subjective experience if the brain is not generating that experience? So you see, in order to explain these things, we tell ourselves the fiction that there is something beyond experience, which we have no access to. It's a theoretical inference. We are restricted to experience by definition. All of existence, as far as we are concerned, is experiential. But we infer within experience, conceptually, that there is this thing outside experience, which in turn generates experience and explains all of these patterns and regularities that I just listed. But that's a theoretical model, and it only makes sense if you don't have another explanation based on consciousness alone, because otherwise you are breaking the principle of parsimony. You are making postulates that are unnecessary to explain the data in front of you. And my point is, and the whole of my philosophy is about explaining these things based on consciousness alone, without postulating anything beyond what we know to be the case, which is mind/consciousness. I use the word mind interchangeably with consciousness.
So, yeah, I've heard you reference it as it in Occam's razor, that we should remove things that are unnecessarily extra if we can maintain the consistency of explanation, and that it doesn't really make sense that we would build our entire world on the postulate of an external universe. Like we've created an entire concept of a whole external universe in order to understand ourselves, which doesn't feel very parsimonious if you can find a way to explain it without that.
Yeah, and you can refute it not only based on parsimony, but based on explanatory power as well. Because you see, not only do you have to postulate an entire universe beyond that which you know to exist, which is the qualities of experience, but then after having done that, you fail to explain experience itself. You explain some patterns and regularities of experience, the structure of experience, but not the qualities of experience, not the nature of experience itself. And that's the hard problem of consciousness. So it's a double whammy. And we are stuck in this for a long time, while there are very viable alternatives around.
And so, I mean, the hard problem of consciousness only becomes a hard problem because we're trying to solve it from a false logic.
Yeah, I mean, I have an analogy to illustrate the absurdity of the hard problem itself. The hard problem is like the following. Imagine that you are an artist and you're trying to explain yourself, what you are. So you go and you paint a self-portrait. The hard problem is this. You point to the portrait and you say, I am that. You say that you are the portrait. But then you can't explain your own inner life based on what you see on the portrait. That's what materialists/physicalists do. They invent this notion of objective matter outside consciousness, which is a theoretical inference. They invent it. Then they say, that thing, that conceptual invention I just made, generates my inner life somehow. And then they try to explain how a conception, an abstraction of consciousness, can explain consciousness itself. Obviously, it will not work. You cannot reduce consciousness to consciousness's own abstractions, for the same reason that you cannot explain the painter based on his paintings. You cannot explain the inner life of a painter you cannot reduce the painter to his paintings. There is more to the painter than his paintings. It's a completely artificial problem. And one day we will look back, maybe decades from now, maybe hundreds of years from now, and we will be in awe of our stupidity, of the silliness of our worldview today. We will look back in horror and think, my God, how could we ever have thought and be convinced of what we think and are convinced of today? We will look back to those people in the past and think they were so out of it. They wouldn't be able to imagine that you could live life based on this assumption of a material world that generates your inner life as an epiphenomenon. But yeah, we'll see.
Mm-hmm. So, all right, I just want to take a quick step back, and then I want to dial into your thoughts on physicalism and this premise that awareness is an epiphenomenon of brain activity, which is going into sort of a different direction I want to take. But first, I want to talk a little bit more about the qualities that define dissociative identity disorder, because I feel like your explanation of this pathology that we observe in people will really help people get a better grasp of how that applies inside the greater mind, or like Huxley's words, like the mind at large.
Yeah.
And if you can, actually, I'll wait for this next question to come after that, if you want to just go from there.
Well, dissociative identity disorder, it's a particularly severe form of dissociation. What it entails is a fragmentation of the contents of consciousness. When our personal consciousness, our personal psyches is operating normally, the mental contents in our psyche are linked to each other through cognitive associations. In other words, a thought can evoke a feeling, which can evoke a memory, which can evoke a behavior, a conscious behavior, which can evoke another thought, which can evoke another feeling, and so on and so forth. Each of these links, these evocations, is a cognitive association. There is an implicit logic that leads one mental content to another, and then to another, and to another. And life is basically a complicated tangle of these cognitive associations between perceptions, thoughts, beliefs, emotions, back to perceptions, thoughts, and so on. That's what life is a tangle of these interconnected contents of consciousness that evoke each other through some kind of implicit logic. Now, dissociation is when these evocations get cut. When one mental content no longer can evoke another. When there is a memory somewhere that you can never evoke based on any thought or perception that you have. So it becomes lost. It's as if you didn't have that piece of your mind anymore, that content of your consciousness. However, dissociation can happen in such a way that you have multiple co-conscious centers of awareness, so to say. That a dissociated alter can be concurrently conscious with another dissociated alter. And there is good clinical evidence that this happens. I would refer to the more recent work of Stephen Broad. He wrote a book in the late 90s about it. But there is intriguing evidence, maybe not conclusive, but very suggestive evidence that this can happen.
And just to be clear, this used to be called like multiple personality disorder or something. That's what you're talking about, right? In case the new terminology is unknown to the listeners.
That's correct. Multiple personality disorder was the old name. In the DSM-5, the statistical manual of mental disorders, it's called dissociative identity disorder. So the idea here would be that there would be multiple personalities that are concurrently conscious, although usually only one is in control of the body. And they are dissociated from each other in the sense that they don't necessarily have full access to each other's inner lives. Now, there has been this study done by Dutch researchers, 2014, I think. They put people with dissociative identity disorder in brain scanners, and they put actors simulating dissociative identity disorders also in the brain scanners, and they compared the patterns of brain activity between the actual patients and the actors simulating it. And they realized that there are very distinct differences. And what this shows is that there is something dissociation looks like from a second person perspective. It's not only a process that you experience from a first person perspective, from the perspective of the inner life of each alter, but there is something it looks like from outside. And you can see what it looks like when you put these people on their brain scanner. Now, this is very suggestive. If there is something dissociation looks like when viewed from the outside, then if universal consciousness is undergoing some form of dissociation, then the alters of universal consciousness should also look like something. There should be something that dissociation at a cosmic level looks like. And my contention is that life is what it looks like. Life is the image of dissociation in universal consciousness. We just don't need a brain scanner to see it because we are inside that nervous system. We don't need to look through a skull with instrumentation. We are already inside. Look around. The image of dissociation around you are the other living organisms around you. You're speaking to one dissociated alter right now. That's my contention.
Mm-hmm. And so an alter is defined by having metabolic processes, like we said earlier, which is separate from what is just sort of a pixel in the larger picture, or the larger mind of reality. And so I was reading one of your essays actually just this morning, getting sort of warmed up, and you made this comment about metabolism. And so, I mean, it becomes obvious then that there is a sense of to be in the inner life of you. I feel that that's there, and in me, and we both have metabolism. And you make comment, so do animals, and so do plants. Plants also have metabolism. And so there's increasing scientific empirical evidence to support that plants have an inner life of some type, regardless of whether or not we can conceptualize it. And then I'm curious what your thoughts are insofar as weather patterns and even the Earth itself, because a weather pattern is obviously some form of metabolic process. It arises, it exists, it consumes, it has a unique pattern of behavior, and then it dies and then dissolves back. And in the same way, the Earth is full of metabolic processes. Would you say that weather patterns and the Earth itself might also have a sense of to be as an alter inside universal mind? And if so, would the same be said of star clusters and various other planets?
I'll try to split my answer in two parts. I'll tell you what I think we have reasons to be very confident about, put a boundary there, and then speculate further about what could be the case, but I don't see compelling reasons to be confident about that. Okay? I'm very confident that metabolism, not things that look like metabolism or things that in some way akin to metabolism or that exhibit patterns that are similar to metabolism. No. I'm talking about metabolism. Metabolism means DNA, transcription, protein folding, internal regulation, and what characterizes biology from single-celled organisms all the way to us, excluding viruses which do not have metabolism. I think there are compelling reasons to say that metabolism, with everything it entails, is what dissociated alters of universal consciousness look like from the perspective of other alters. In other words, from our perspective as dissociated alters ourselves. There is reason for this, that it's not only theoretical, but empirical as well. We know that, for instance, even amoeba, single-celled organisms, exhibit behavior that is akin to our own in some ways. Amoeba pick up microscopic sand grains from the mud in which they live and construct vases that are amazingly symmetrical for them to inhabit. It's incredible behavior for a single-celled organism. Plants have very sophisticated signaling networks. There is even a proposal, there was a proposal 10 years ago, I think it's been taken seriously still, to create a new field of study called plant neurobiology. It's a very bold proposal, attracted a lot of criticism as well, but it shows that there is compelling behavior in plants that's analogous to our own. And we know that we have dissociated inner lives. I know I have consciousness, that I experience things, and I know I do not know what's happening in your head or what's happening in the head of, in the inner life of the inanimate universe as a whole. So I am dissociated. And to the extent that other things like single-celled organisms, plants, and other living beings manifest behaviors similar to mine, I can infer with good confidence that they also have dissociated inner lives, and therefore that they are also the extrinsic appearance of other authors in universal consciousness. Okay, that's what I'm confident of. Is a weather pattern metabolism? Strictly speaking, it is not metabolism. There is no DNA going on, there is no transcription, it's not metabolizing. But I acknowledge that there are patterns in weather systems that resemble metabolism, or that are akin to metabolism. Now, a resemblance does not mean identity. We have to keep that in mind. Otherwise, I would believe that certain computers are conscious. I don't believe they are. An analogy I always make is even if I make a very accurate simulation of kidney function in my computer, it doesn't mean that my computer will start urinating on my desk, because a simulation is not the phenomenon it simulates. Resemblance is not identity. So I do not feel confident that the Earth as a whole is an alter in its own merit, that there is something it is like to be planet Earth as a whole, or that there is something it's like to be a storm, or that there is something it's like to be the sun, which also has highly complex patterns of electromagnetic activity in its plasma. I do not feel confident about any of these things. Do I entertain the speculation sometimes? Surely, in a nice Friday evening with friends around a campfire, sure. Would I defend this view? No. No, I would not defend this view. I don't feel confident at all about it. I feel very confident about metabolism, biology.
So one of the other things that pulled me into your work after the metaphysics of psychedelics, and this is going to definitely tap into what we've been talking about here, was I guess like an opinion piece. Maybe I'm describing it wrong, but your perspective on the at the time the new science of the neurobiology and the metabolism of psilocybin in the brain, the fMRI studies of what's happening to a person under psilocybin, and your issue with it was that it represented what was obvious as the epiphenomenon of consciousness arising from brain activity. And in that discussion, you talked about a global reduction of brain activity and a reduction of brain activity in the aspects of the brain that sort of constitute our sense of identity as being correlated with an increase in perceivable richness of experience. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about why this is the case. Why is it that as our sense of identity and the functioning of our brains begins to reduce or dispel, that an increased richness of inner life emerges?
Yeah, these studies, there were studies done at Imperial College in the UK. There was a study done in Brazil about the effects of ayahuasca. In the Imperial College, they studied psilocybin and LSD. The initial studies, when they came out for the first time in January 2012, they had a very surprising conclusion, which was that psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, only reduced brain activity. There were no increases in brain activity compared to the placebo baseline anywhere in the brain. And that was very counterintuitive. It led Christoph Koch, that eminent neuroscientist, to write an article in Scientific American Mind expressing his surprise. Because you see, under the paradigm that conscious life is brain activity, you would expect a psychedelic that, to say that it increases the richness of conscious inner life is an understatement, right? It's the understatement of the century, and it blows it up to proportions that nobody who never did it will ever be able to fathom.
Oh, yeah.
And then to imagine that despite this subjective effect is not increasing brain activity, if brain activity is conscious in their life, it seems to be impossible, seems to be a contradiction. And that was what everybody thought until that point in January 2012. So it was a very counterintuitive observation that they made from the perspective of physicalism, this idea that experience is generated by brain activity. That has been confirmed in other studies, although, and that's a bit of a concern I have, researchers are now, and have for a while, been focusing on trying to find something that does increase in the brain. as a consequence of psychedelic intake. As if, if it's not brain activity like everybody expected, to defend physicalism, we need to find something else that does increase. And it could be activity synchronization, or it could be, or randomness, whatever. People are looking for something that does increase. The problem is that
it's being fueled by confirmation bias.
I don't want to pass that judgment. Obviously, this is a hypothesis. This is a possibility. Yeah. I don't want to pass that judgment yet. I would just report. I'm trying to report on facts here. There is an attempt to find something that does increase. So the same group published a year or two later another study in which they found that the spectral power in certain areas of the brain associated with dreaming did increase. And it was translated by the press and even by one of the study co-authors who did not understand the signal processing analysis done by the study's first author. They translated that into, after all, psychedelics do increase brain activity. No, the increase of spectral power does not mean that activity increased. It only means that activity variation increases. You see, you can have a very low level of activity with a lot of variation, and that is still less activity than a high level of constant activity. So what increased was activity variation, not activity itself. And it got picked up by the press, and there were pictures published in all kinds of, science, popular science magazines and media outlets, even CNN, basically outright spelling the conclusion, the opposite conclusion of what was justified by the observations. They were saying activity increases. It didn't. Read the darn paper. It's written right there. And now it's activity variation that increased, not activity itself, not metabolism. So my conclusion stands, I think, to this day. And it's not only psychedelics. And that's the big thing. There was a study done last year, Vietnam War veterans who had sustained a significant brain damage, and they realized that brain damage in certain areas of the brain correlated with feelings of self-transcendence and susceptibility to mystical experiences of highly enriched inner life. Things like the choking game, which you probably have heard about. Many teenagers do that self-strangulation, right to the point where you pass out, but before you die, hopefully. It leads to amazing feelings of self-transcendence, incredibly rich inner life. So there are many instances of phenomenology, of things that impair brain activity, which lead then to enriched inner life. There was even a study from Brazil, a neuroimaging study of mediums. I reserve judgment on this whole medium thing, but the study itself is interesting. They put mediums under a brain scanner, and they realized that experienced mediums, when they were psychographing, writing things that are supposed from a transcendent source, whatever, they had significantly lowered brain activity than controls. And yet they could write much more complex written material, than controls could with normal brain activity levels. So there is a compelling pattern. I published this on Scientific American and 29 March, I think.
Yeah, I'll make sure that that article and your other essays and stuff are all included in the show notes for listeners if they want to dip in.
So there is this compelling pattern associating impaired brain activity, certain types of impaired brain activity. Not all of it, of course. If you impair your language centers, if you impair metacognition, if you impair memory pathways, you may be having an amazingly rich experience, but you will not be able to report that to yourself or to others, or you may not be able to remember that, or you may not be able to speak, or you may be a vegetable. So it's not all brain activity that will give you evidence in this regard. The evidence is necessarily constrained to a very delicate window between damage to impairment of brain activity that renders you unable to report anything, and damage that's not sufficient to trigger an enriched inner life. But there is this pattern, and how would I explain this? I would say normal brain activity is the image of dissociation. So if you impair normal brain activity and reduce brain activity, then dissociation will reduce. What is a reduction of dissociation? It's an enrichment of inner life. So I think this evidence plays very well with the very old view, thousands of years old, that I'm just re-articulating recently. And I think people should pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm. And so to just find another way to explain what you were talking about, what you're saying is that as the brain becomes damaged, as the organ that I might accidentally maintain some like causal sort of language as I talk about this, pardon me, but as the brain that sort of maintains the identity, or like when our brain is properly functioning, our alter is intact, that as it begins to be damaged, the boundaries between the alter and the mind at large, like the mind and reality as a singular thing, start to break, and we start to almost like through the cracks in the damaged aspects of the alter let in more of what's already there, but we're disconnected from. Those disconnections of cognitive associations become reconnected, and we get an increased richness. Now, I've heard you use the metaphor of a stream, like a stream of consciousness, and that the alters are little whirlpools where it's localizations of various thought processes within like the larger mind or the mind of God or reality, and that the liquid is reflective, and that inside of this whirlpool, this little localization, the thought processes that are reflecting back and forth inside the little whirlpool are what we constitute as our me, our individual identity, and that we exist inside of that. We can't tap into the larger stream, but that brain damage or death is a process by which that localization softens. And this is something that I thought really hit me well when I heard you mention it, is that if all that we perceive as the external reality is various thought processes in the larger mind, that includes just the nervous tissue, but then also the metabolic alters, that when the whirlpool dissolves and it merges back in with the water, as the self-identity dissolves and it merges back in with mind, so does the body dissolve and merge back in with nature, and that it's all sort of correlative. And I just found that to be a really beautiful way to describe it. Did I miss anything, or can you expand on anything there?
You put it in very clear terms. I mean, it's always a struggle to try to communicate these ideas in our present-day cultural milieu, right? People have so many unexamined assumptions that to break through that is difficult. So sometimes I appeal to all kinds of metaphors to try to get people to actually listen to what I'm saying. They hear, but sometimes it's rare that they actually listen to what I'm trying to say. So the whirlpool metaphor was one. And in more technical terms, our sense of self comes from what in psychology is called meta-consciousness, which is your ability to be explicitly aware of certain experiences, to not only experience, but to know that you experience. Mm-hmm. That's meta-consciousness, which is related to metacognition. And in the brain, there is a pattern of brain activity in people that's normally called the default mode network, which correlates to your sense of self, this metacognitive behavior, in the absence of perception, in the absence of input. So if you close your eyes and you're in a silent place and you start ruminating, the area of your brain that lights up is the default mode network. It's sort of this part of your personal psyche that turns in upon itself in order to gain knowledge of its own status, its own state, its mind analyzing its own state. And what's interesting is that psychedelics seem to reduce activity precisely in the default mode network. That's the case for psilocybin. That's the case for ayahuasca, which is DMT. It goes precisely to that part of your consciousness that folds in upon itself and creates that sense of personal identity and dissolves it partially. And then the moment you do that, you make the dissociative boundary porous, if you will, and all kinds of things stream in through this cognitive reconnection that you described.
Mm-hmm. And great. So moving into the next question, again, back referencing to some of the things you were saying, that so it seems in this discussion, to me, it immediately checked in like, oh, that makes sense. Like, I've had many experiences with psychedelics. I've been thinking about the nature of mind for a long while. I had several of my own ideas. I have what was my experience, and then my effort to sort of logically construct my experience, and then the effort to build rhetoric out of that logical construction of my experience. And upon finding your work, I was like, oh, yeah, perfect. This guy is not only explaining what I'm already trying to figure out, but he's also bringing in pieces that I otherwise would have missed with an explanatory power that I just don't necessarily have the foundations to construct in the rhetoric. And it became abundantly clear now. I had some sort of like logical basis to say that there is no difference between body and mind, in a way, that the mind, the personal mind, the me, the identity, is not an epiphenomenon of the body. It's not like an extra piece. The body and the mind, the personal mind, are the same. They're one. They're correlative.
The body is an image in mind, right? There's nothing to the body but an image in mind, an image that can be constituted by visual images, but also sounds, sensations. The body is in the mind, not the mind in the body. Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Thank you for that clarification. I think it's beautiful. Now, one of the base assumptions, the unchecked assumptions, like you said, that most people have is this sort of, even if they have spiritual ideals, there's still like a physicalist assumption at the bottom of it. And obviously this is because the sort of primary worldview is based on, or at least the developing one in North America and what the Western world is based in the progress of secularism, even though it's still based very deeply in the moral ethics of Christianity and Abrahamic traditions all over the world. But that it's based in secularism, and secularism is deeply influenced by, quote, science, and science has a strong association or connection to this physicalist worldview. And I want you to maybe talk about why, I'm kind of fishing, but like, how is it that physicalism has come to be? I'm thinking about sort of Nietzsche's The Death of God and the emergence of physicalism sort of like coming up around the same time. Why is there such a strong attachment and defensiveness to physicalism, such as we see in like the neo-atheists, right? And for example, as much as I really love and respect and enjoy his work, in Sam Harris, you often reference him as sort of the antithesis to your ontological angle. Can you just talk about physicalism and touch into your recent essay about it as a mechanism of defense? Yeah.
Well, there are two ways to look at that. One is, why do people who do not have an investment in physicalism, they didn't co-create it, they're not promoting it, they're not academics, they're not scientists, they're just regular people in the streets, why do they buy into it? I think that's one angle. And it's an angle I didn't explore in the paper you're alluding to. And I think that the reason even religious people at the end of the day actually think that when they are dead, and that's the end of it. In other words, they buy into the implications of physicalism. Why do they do that? I think what's behind that is a very deeply ingrained fear, maybe even terror, of disappointment. We have, as a society, come to the point where we tend to believe the worst case scenario because we are afraid of believing something else and then getting disappointed. So reality has become associated with the brute, hard, horrible facts of nature. Know what I mean? It even sounds like it's true, the way I said that, the brute, hard facts.
Right, like an emergence of the interpretation, like Darwinian survivalism, or
maybe it has something to do with that. I think there are historical reasons for that, but we have come to associate reality with the worst case scenario, And that's what we actually believe. We believe that what probably is true is actually the worst possible case. And that's why so many regular people seem to deep inside buy into physicalism. That's one reason. Another reason is that, the authorities of society are telling them that this is what is true. This is what is true. Physicalism. The idea that your mind, your experiences is just something generated by your brain. When your brain is dead, you're over. You're over and done with. You just disappear. And if authorities are saying that, and people project a lot onto authority figures, it's very hard for you to maintain the force of your own perspective when you're facing this enormous cultural monster of authority figures telling you otherwise.
Like a combination of negativity bias and preference falsification.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think that would explain things to some extent, at least, for people who are not vested in physicalism. Now, physicalism didn't come out of a vacuum. It was conjured up by people, promoted by people, believed in by people who then joined ranks and continued to promote it. And that promotion has extended from, early in the 19th century, maybe late in the 18th century, all the way to today. Why do they do that? And as you read in that essay I wrote, I think it's an egoic defense mechanism. It's a mechanism of ego defense, and there are many reasons why physicalism helps psychologically those who create and promote it. I talk a lot about the meaning in the paper that you alluded to. It's only one of the sections in the paper, but it's a particularly interesting one for me, at least, because a lot of people tend to think that physicalism destroys meaning. If at the end of the day, the second law of thermodynamics means that all life will end and all conscious experience will end and all memory will disappear, then life is meaningless anyway, right? Physicalism seems to destroy all meaning. So how come people who promote physicalism could get a boost in their own sense of meaning in order for physicalism to be an ego defense? You see, studies have shown that we derive our sense of meaning from several sources. We derive our sense of meaning from belonging, from being part of something bigger than us. We derive our sense of meaning from self-validation, from the belief that we are special in some sense, in some way, that we are better than others. There are many sources of meaning, and there is a theory in social psychology, the meaning maintenance model, which shows that if one source of meaning is threatened, then you will shift that psychic energy, so to say, to the other sources. You reinforce the other sources of meaning in order to compensate for it. Physicalism destroys only one source of meaning, the source of transcendent meaning that you have from religion. But if you're part of the intellectual elite that promotes physicalism, you get a boost in many other ways. You get a boost, for instance, in your sense of belonging to an enterprise that is that will endure beyond yourself, and that's the enterprise of science with its cosmic ambitions about figuring out how the entire universe works. If there is anything Promethean ever to come out of human culture, it must be that, right? And anything else is less Promethean than that. There are many other boosts to meaning that I relate in the paper. I have the paper here next to me. This is the paper you're alluding to, right?
Yeah, the physicalist worldview as neurotic ego defense mechanism.
Defense mechanism, yeah.
Which, again, will be in the show notes for the show for anyone who wants to give it a read.
Yeah. So, counterintuitive as it may be, may seem at least, if you really analyze the psychology behind physicalism, there are many reasons to believe that it's an egoic defense mechanism. The people who reviewed this paper made a comment to me that it's ironic that I was using a scientific journal, a very respected scientific journal, by the way. Sage is the world's premier publisher of academic psychology work. That I was using a scientific channel basically to say that the worldview of most scientists was an ego defense mechanism, a highly biased, prejudiced psychological maneuver. But anyway, they accepted the paper. So.
Again, well, I thank you for creating a rhetoric that sustains a logic with enough explanatory power for me to hold my own in conversations around that, for sure. Because there is no, I think I might have gone into an unnecessary denigration of people identifying with the worldview if I had finished that comment, which I don't want to do. Bernardo, this has been an absolutely wonderful conversation, and I, again, really appreciate the work that you are doing, and I thank you for the impact it's had on my life. Thank you very much, and I appreciate you offering your time today. Is there any links or specific connections that you'd like to offer the listeners to get a hold of what you do?
Everything is on my site, bernardokastrup.com. From there, you have links to papers, books, talks, videos. It's all in there.
Great. Again, thank you so much for your time, Bernardo.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure speaking to you again.
Well, I have to be serious with you for a second. This interview was one of my favorite interviews that I've done, period. So every interview has a place in my heart. Each one has a significance, and each one is really meaningful. But there's a few that have really stood out for me, and were because they were opportunities for me to have a conversation and for me to tease out and present to you the information of people who have really deeply inspired me, and this is one of those episodes. So I'm very happy to have shared it with you. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it and you'd like to let other people know, how much you enjoyed it, you can share it on whatever social media platform you like. This is a small show and it grows by word of mouth, so a simple share actually goes a really long way. Another way to support the show is to head to jameswjesso.com/support and drop a little economic encouragement by way of Patreon, PayPal, or some form of cryptocurrency. Normally I work with Bitcoin or Ethereum, but we can sort that out if you want to send me cryptocurrencies, because it's very exciting for me right now learning this whole industry. So thank you very much in advance for your support of the show and for your donations and for your shout-outs. I look forward to bringing you episode number 51, 52, 110, 370, and continuing to grow in this journey with you, the listeners. So yeah, thank you. Take care.